Hey everyone, welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about transference and countertransference in the counseling process and why that means that counselors need their own therapy. To set up this video, we received a comment recently on another video where a therapist was talking about how when they sought out their own therapy, what it boiled down to is it sounds like this therapist who was seeking counseling for themselves was actually starting to provide something for the therapist that they were seeing. So the dynamic got all shifted around, and that was all because what this commenter is supposing is that these therapists that they saw had their own issues that weren't quite worked out, and they were using that therapy process to work it out when they should have been doing it on their own time instead of when they should have been providing services for this commenter in the first place. So that's a little confusing, but let's break it down here today and talk about why therapists need therapy. So really early on in the counseling education process, we talk about two concurrent processes called transference and countertransference. And what that means is basically they're two sides of the same coin. When a client or a patient has certain patterns in their background, certain experiences in their background, then sometimes they'll project that or see that in the counseling relationship. One way that I try to be aware of potential transference is whenever I'm seeing somebody who has experienced sexual assault or abuse from a male authority figure, because in that counseling space, I'm occupying a role as a male authority figure. Even if I'm not trying to bring in authority, there's just a natural power dynamic within the client and counselor relationship that I need to be aware of. I need to be checking myself, and I need to be checking in with my client to see, are you noticing anything in that dynamic that is bringing up uncomfortable feelings for you, past resentments and hurts? And if so, we need to talk about that and how we can work around that, because that can impede progress for counseling and also lead to difficulties with communication and our relationship in the therapeutic alliance. So that's transference. The flip side of that is what we're talking about today is countertransference. And that is when the counselor or the therapist as a person, they have their own stuff, they have their own baggage that we bring into that room with us. And what happens in countertransference is when we see some of those things in our clients that bring up emotions in ourselves, or resistance or resentment or any other kinds of feelings, that can be a problem because that can hinder our ability to be objective, to be empathetic, to be kind, and to provide the client with what they need. And this is the process that commenter was talking about, is that apparently these other providers, these mental health providers, were having their own countertransference, and this commenter felt sidelined as a result of that. They weren't getting what they needed out of the process. It was becoming about what the counselor wanted or needed. So let me lay this out here. For any therapists or counselors out there, it's okay for you to have your own baggage. It's okay for you to have your own background. That is what makes you unique as a mental health provider. And that also leads to certain strengths that you bring into the process as well. So this is where it's important for both therapists and for people seeking mental health services to recognize therapists are people too. We have our own backgrounds, we have our own upbringing, strengths, weaknesses, all of that good stuff. And that doesn't stop just because we become a counselor. What's important in that is to recognize, okay, where are my strengths, where are my weaknesses, what triggers me, what gets me going emotionally, and to be aware of that, to journal through that, get counseling through that. And it's important for us to be aware of those potential strengths and weaknesses so that we can accentuate the strengths, lean into those, and also be ready to deal with any times that we get triggered, any times that we start getting emotional in a session when we're supposed to be providing that objectivity and that care for somebody else, and so we don't make the session about us and our needs. So for example, one of the things that I have to be aware of for myself is that I was raised to be very hardworking, to value the process and the work that goes into doing something well. And so when I work with students particularly who might come across as lazy, who have these goals but are just not taking the steps to achieve those goals, that becomes difficult for me. I have to start catching myself and start being aware that my standards for laziness, hard work, responsibility, whatever you want to call it, are not necessarily the same as theirs, and I can't impose my values on them. While I might get frustrated if I were to do some of those things that they're doing, I cannot take that frustration and put it onto them, because that's not for them to carry. That is not for them to worry about, because that's my value. And if I don't do my own work in reflecting on that and being aware of that, that can very easily come across as me just being another parent, another teacher, someone who's just writing them to do their homework in a certain way, to study in a certain way, instead of them finding their solutions for themselves. So that hinders the therapeutic process. And so here's probably the hard part for counselors and therapists. We're told over and over again, yes, seek counseling to work through your own stuff so that it doesn't become an issue during a session where you're trying to provide mental health services. That's all well and good. Another therapist was realizing that because of their own history with abuse and trauma, they were having emotions come up for them as they were getting assigned cases dealing with abuse, trauma, and other things to that nature. And they were finding that they were getting emotional during session, feeling guilty that they weren't able to keep it together. And so this other person has gone through therapy for their trauma. They've worked through some of this stuff. But as we know with trauma, it doesn't just go away. And so that raises a really important question. When we get into those situations where there is a trigger and our emotions are going, what are we supposed to do with that? At that point, it's too late to excuse ourselves and find ourselves our own therapy session to do our work. The solution to this might look different for each mental health provider. So I'm not trying to give a catch-all kind of solution for this, but I think it's important to keep two things in mind. The first being that we're aware of what some of our triggers are. If we're aware that certain kinds of clients trigger strong emotions in us, we need to be aware of that. Not to say that we won't see them, but to prepare ourselves and recognize, okay, there might be some stuff that comes up for me. And to, with that preparation, also think of, if something does come up, what do I plan to do with that? That helps us to be confident of, okay, I've thought this through, I've talked with my colleagues, I've talked with my supervisor if applicable, and this is how I plan to handle that. What I would also encourage is not necessarily to just try to sideline those feelings or push those away, because that's one of the things we tell our clients not to do, but to be able to acknowledge the emotionality behind it, but still center it on the client. So there might be times where I might say something like, wow, that is really heavy and I feel the weight of that. And I'm just taking a moment here to really give that the attention and the feeling that it deserves. And just being able to say that, acknowledge that what they're talking about is difficult and that you're really feeling it, you're with them, and not in a way that they have to start comforting you or start making you feel better, but still centering that on the client. I feel how heavy that is for you. That can be a game changer in terms of being authentic with who you are as a person within the therapy space, but also making sure that the session is still about your client. Bottom line for this, your therapist is a person as well. And that does not mean you're responsible for their emotions when you are seeing them as a professional, but that they should be doing their own work behind the scenes. And for therapists, to have a plan of action in place for when you recognize that there are potentially going to be challenges for you. And for those people seeking mental health services, this is a way for you to keep your counselor accountable as well. It's not a moral failing if they start getting emotional during session, because like I said, we all have our own backgrounds and sometimes we don't know what's going on with our therapist. Everyone, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is definitely a challenging topic to talk about, but because therapists are people, it's important for both therapists and clients to be able to know what's going on behind the scenes with some of the stuff with transference and countertransference. Please go ahead and like and subscribe to the channel. That helps us to grow and continue creating content for you all. Again, thanks so much for checking out this video. See you all next time.